Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. All the things that are going on in the world right now, I'm sure have got a lot of us scratching our heads, wondering what is valid, what is untrue. And tonight we're going to take a break from what we normally do, which is study the Word of God, the most important thing for us to do as a body of Christ. And we are going to talk about biblical things, but we're going to look at them in a little bit different format rather than going through a passage and exegeting it like we normally would. We're going to talk about some of the things happening in our world. And the first thing I want to introduce to you tonight, for some of you, is a rule. It's actually a philosophy rule. It's called bivalence. And what bivalence means is that any proposition or theory is either true or it's not true. It can't be neither, and it can't be both. And what we're hearing a lot about today is conspiracies, and some are saying that this whole thing with the election is just sore losers on the Republican side. Others are saying, no, there's been something afoot. And, the reality is one of those two is true and the other is not. They both can't be true and they both can't be false. One of them has to be factual. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Our title for this particular session is Conspiracy or Fact. And we're going to talk about some of the things going on in our world. And the outcome of this is I hope you can weigh the things that are presented and come to your own conclusion. I know that I have, based on the evidence that we're going to discuss tonight, that there is something afoot, and it is of a conspiratorial nature, so to speak. And this isn't anything unusual. Now, the first thing I want to remind us all of is that the world is headed in a predicted and predetermined direction. The Bible tells us quite clearly that we are headed toward a time where there is going to be a single rule situation over the whole of the world, and it's going to be headed up by a man called the Antichrist, or the beast of Revelation chapter 13. So that is the lens through which we view all alleged conspiracies and plots against the church and these other things, recognizing that the church is absolutely headed in that direction. I also want to draw our attention to the fact that the people of God have been abused and oppressed by governmental systems throughout the history of both Israel and the church. And there are many biblical examples of someone who is a person of God in the Old Testament, an Old Testament saint like Joseph, who was sent in prison for a false accusation. And in that sense, he was arrested, wrongly accused by a government official named Potiphar. We also know that Daniel, because of some government officials, knowing that he would not bow down when he was going to pray. I was thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who also were oppressed by the government under the Babylonian Empire at the same time as Daniel. But Daniel found himself in a position where government officials had come up with a plan, really, that they were hoping to trap Daniel. They said, this guy's a man of integrity. We're not going to trap him by finding him violating some kind of law or being unfaithful to the king or, extorting money from Babylonians or stealing from the government. We're not going to find him guilty and find an accusation against him through any of those means. So we're going to have to find a problem with his faith. It's going to be about his religion that we're going to be able to trap him. So they orchestrated a plan where they made an ordinance and presented it to the king and told the king, the law of the Medes and Persians doesn't change. So if you sign this thing, it's law and it's irreversible. And so the king signed an edict that nobody could pray to anybody except to the king himself for 30 days. Well, Daniel, we're told, knew that the edict was signed, and yet he went home, and as was his custom from his early days, he threw open his windows. He was, remember, in Babylonian captivity, so he prayed facing Jerusalem, the holy city, and he prayed 3 times as he had always done, even though the government threatened him and other government officials threatened him with the lion's den if he violated the king's edict, which he did. King found out. King couldn't reverse his own law according to the Medo-Persian governmental system. Daniel winds up in the lion's den. He was oppressed by government officials, even though the king was reluctant and knew that he had been tricked by the satraps and governors and administrators, and they're actually the ones who wound up in the lion's den. Now, We also know that accusations came against Nehemiah, who, after the Babylonian captivity, returned to Jerusalem, was responsible and commissioned by God to rebuild the wall of the city and the gates of the city and many of the streets and thoroughfares and homes throughout the city. And there was constant oppression on him as well. What was he accused of? He was accused of violating King Artaxerxes' authority, and that he was trying to set up his own kingdom and all these other things. So the accusation against him was that he was not a friend of the state or friend of the government. Now, this is important because this is exactly the direction that things are headed in now, because we know during the tribulation that anyone who names the name of Christ is going to be beheaded for their unwillingness to worship the Antichrist, as reported in Revelation chapter 13. So we know the world is headed in that direction. We know that the people of God have long been oppressed, and there have been conspiracies against the church. And this is what I think is most important for us to recognize above all else. And whether it's about, Democrats or Republicans or whatever label people are trying to throw at this, the reality is the bottom line is that Satan hates the church, he hates Israel, and he's seeking to bring about the reign of his own man. As we're told in Revelation 13, the dragon or Satan gives the Antichrist his power. And what's he do with his power? Well, first of all, he demands worship of himself. And secondly, he kills everybody who refuses to worship him. So again, this whole idea of there being governmental efforts to destroy the church or dismantle the church is nothing new. And we have to understand we live in a very distinct age right now. We have in our country and the rest of the world, not Republicans and Democrats, even though that's the label that many bear, the true division of the two political arenas, so to speak, in which every politician falls, one or the other, is they're either a globalist or they are a nationalist, meaning that they believe in their own country and taking care of their country first and making their own country a priority, where the vast majority of politicians in the world today are globalists. They believe that we are a global community and therefore the greater good is to do what's right for the whole world and not be nationalistic in your thinking. And for the first time, I believe, in human history, loving your country is viewed negatively, and it's viewed as anti-greater good, so to speak. And therefore, men like President Donald Trump are looked down upon by the rest of the global community. Now, we have to remember in recent years, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, went as far to say Trump has destroyed everything that we have been working toward. What have they been working toward? They've been working toward a global community, globalism, a new world order, and a select group of people who are going to rule the world. Now, what role exactly does this election play in all this? What is actual fact? And is there conspiracy against the church that is happening today? And I want to give you some things to consider, some things to remember. But the bottom line we have to recognize is that the Antichrist agenda is satanically inspired. Now, if we think back even to the history of Israel, remember when the children of Israel went to Samuel the prophet and said, "We want a king like other nations." And the Lord said, Samuel was mad. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen, they have rejected you, they've rejected me." And they're asking for what the world has, and they're basically saying, we don't want God to rule over us. We want a human being like other nations have, someone who's going to physically fight our battles and deal with all the other things that we have to struggle with every day. And so God said, "Listen, go tell the people, here's what he's going to do. He's going to take your property, he's going to commandeer your possessions, he's going to take your livestock, he's going to put your sons and daughters into his service." And the people said, "That sounds good, we'll take it." And that's exactly what they got. And we also have to remember that we are being told through scripture that when the righteous are in authority, in Proverbs 29:2, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, the people groan. Now, we have the opportunity to choose rejoicing or groaning here in this country. But we also have to recognize, and people often make the argument, there's nobody righteous to vote for. Now, the word righteous in the Hebrew there in Proverbs 29:2 actually means the lawful. someone who is going to obey laws and enforce laws. And when people who operate within the system of laws and the structure of laws, they're going to bring a rejoicing to those whom they have responsibility over. But when people are in these places who do not enforce the law, who do not obey the law, who violate the law, and thus are serving the adversary, Satan, the lawless one, who is the father of all lies, who only comes to steal, kill, and destroy, then when people are serving him, basically, then the people are going to groan who are under their rulership and tyranny. And that's exactly what we're choosing here in these United States. Now, there's a lot of talk about stealing the election. There's a lot of talk about, votes that have been falsified, document ballots that have been falsified, dead people voting. All these kind of things are being reported. And so we need to know what the truth is. We need to know what's conspiracy and what's fact, and is there one at all? And personally, as I said, I think the fact is that there's long been a conspiracy that is inspired by Satan to persecute and prosecute the people of God and to diminish the role of the church in these last days in particular. I think all of us have seen throughout this pandemic, there's been efforts to quench the church's ability to meet, and we're told not to sing where the Bible commands us to sing praises to the Lord. We're told, oh, that's a high risk situation, so you can't sing. You can't have communion, which we're told to do this in remembrance of Jesus, by Jesus himself. When we come together, and the breaking of bread and the sharing of the cup instituted at the Last Supper by Jesus himself is one of the ordinances that God, one of the two ordinances that God gave the church, that and water baptism being the other. These are both things that recognize, one, the body and blood of Jesus as he died for us, and baptism also talks about the newness of life we have, having become dead in Christ and alive in him, and are crucified with Christ and alive in him. So there is something going on. There's no question about it, and it always has been motivated by the devil. He has always tried to destroy God's people from the time of Pharaoh and the Israelite captivity or bondage in Egypt, all the way up to the destruction of all male children under the 2 years of age at the time of Jesus' birth by Herod, the efforts of Hitler and others to destroy the Jews, Stalin and others to destroy Christians. And so the effort has always been against God's people. So is there a conspiracy against the church today? Absolutely. Is there a conspiracy against Israel today? Absolutely. Does this election have anything to do with advancing that? Absolutely. I believe it does. But you weigh the evidence yourself and see if there's been a manipulation of this recent election back on November 3rd for President of the United States and other offices. So I want to present some facts to you. These aren't things that are hearsay. These are documented news stories, things that are publicly available, and you can go to the great theologian Google and search there as well, and or Dr. Google, as some call him, or it rather, I should say, and find this information yourself. But let me just tell you a couple of things that have been going on. Now, there's been a lot of talk about a conspiracy amongst the Democrats to throw this election, and there's some evidence that basically leans toward that being true. And remember, it's either true or false. Can't be neither, can't be both. It has to be factual or non-factual, and there are no other options in considering this particular proposition. Now, the interesting thing is that we voted in a different manner this time. And we've all, and my wife and I, Terry and I, have stood in line for many, many years, and we've done some absentee balloting as well because of our travels and all those other things. But we have long taken great pride and thank the Lord for the privilege of voting in this country for those who will be in positions of power in this country. But this year was different. All of a sudden, we're in a situation where you can stand in line at Walmart, you can stand in line at Costco, and according to a recent Harvard study, there is a low risk factor for contracting COVID on an airplane if you wear your mask the whole time, but it's too risky to stand in line and vote, so everybody has to mail in their ballots. Now, was this part of some kind of conspiracy? Well, you judge for yourself. Let me tell you one thing as we continue here right off the bat. Since August of 2020, the Biden campaign has filed 60 different lawsuits around the country. 60 different lawsuits just from August 2020. Dating back to 2018, the Democrats have filed, under the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, they have filed 300 different lawsuits in all 50 states around the country. And do you know what these lawsuits were about? Every one of these lawsuits, all 300 from 2018, all 60 since August of 2020, were about changing the security protocols for absentee and mail-in ballots. And what that means is there's a system to guarantee that there's nothing that's being inserted into the flow of ballots that isn't from a registered voter, and also that they are counted in a manner where there are observers from both parties who have direct and equal access to the counting process to make sure there's no fraud involved. It also, according to our Constitution, when an election is over, when the last poll closes, based on the various time zones in the United States, the election is over. Well, they wanted to change the ability for mail-in voters to be received and counted after the last poll closed in any given state, and they wanted to change the manner by which Americans voted in the first place. And so they changed it to this mail-in method. In some states it was mandatory, others you could vote in person or do both. And the number of mail-in votes was astronomical. Now, here's the thing. Here's another thing I think that's interesting. And in the midst of all this, in the midst of all that we have seen go on, in the midst of all the things that we've been hearing in the media, we've been talking about and hearing about software that has been programmed to change the vote of a particular ballot when it's transferred from the point where the vote is counted and to where it's received and numbered with votes, other votes from that state. Now, this is a fact. I mean, it's been proven time and again that there were glitches, and even some of the mainstream media has had the courage and the forthrightness to admit that there have been ballot irregularities. And it's been talked about as a software glitch. Well, it wasn't a glitch, because a glitch doesn't always go in one direction. When you've got something that's changing votes from Trump to Biden exclusively and never in reverse, that's not a glitch. That's something that's been planned and inserted into the software for that particular purpose. Now, we've seen this happen, and we've heard stories about Dominion software being designed, and Nancy Pelosi's husband being a major stockholder in Dominion software. And to be honest, I couldn't validate that or verify that anywhere. But I have listened to some pretty interesting information about the Hammer and Scorecard software system that was basically initiated by the US government, created for the CIA for tracking terrorist activity after 9/11 in our country. Well, there's a very high-level retired Air Force officer who was part of this program when it was initiated and used for that purpose for which it was designed, to track terrorists, who says that during the Obama administration, that this was hijacked and there was software language written in, or code language that was written in for the purpose of changing votes. And this has been involved. And he even made the case and went as far to say it's very possible that actually Bernie Sanders won the Democratic nomination and not Joe Biden. But Bernie wasn't the guy that the Democrats wanted in. It was Joe Biden who was going to continue that which Obama began, which was his desire that he stated openly and part of his platform, which was to fundamentally transform America. And that's been the goal. And that's what's happening and continuing to happen even now. I'm sorry, Siri's listening. Can you imagine that? Siri's listening to me talk and asking me what I want on my iPad off to the side. So here we've got lawsuits filed from 2018, 360 total in number, all with the same purpose, to change the security protocols for the mail-in and absentee ballot system. Now, here's the thing. Here's the other thing I think we need to recognize, and what I believe is part of this whole greater conspiracy, and that is that the absentee ballots wouldn't be enough to turn an election, so to speak. You couldn't change all of them, and the software, this Hammer and Scorecard software, is designed to change 3% of the votes. And oddly enough, those who have seen these computer and software glitches are reporting exactly that number. About 3% of the votes have been changed in their transfer from the point of gathering to the point, final point or destination or will it be attributed to the whole of the state's vote? So 3% of the absentee ballots would be the whole net of this voter change, and that wouldn't throw any election unless it was extremely close. And generally they're just not that close, not close enough to have the desired impact that they desired when they planned this. So now, what that brings us to is a rather interesting conspiracy, so to speak, or is it fact? And that is that it became necessary for more ballots to be processed through the mail system than just absentee ballots. And this is why there's been so much talk about the pandemic and the exploitation of the pandemic. And as I've said every time I've talked about this, we recognize that the coronavirus and SARS-2 COVID-19, as is the medical name for this disease or virus, has taken people's lives. There's no question about it. But here's something that I've been watching that I find to be very curious as we see so many odd things happening, things that just don't make sense, things that don't add up, things that are they coincidence? I don't think so. Is there a conspiracy, and are things being formulated for the purpose of bringing about a desired end? I believe that that is actually what's true. And I want you to think about this. The United States has a population of some 320 million people. We're just a small fraction of the total world population of over 8 billion. Yet here we are with this small fragment or fraction of global society, and yet there have been more deaths, more positive test cases in the United States than in countries with populations of people 3 and 4 times our size. Now, how is it that the most medically advanced country in the world, the most technologically advanced country in the world, has more cases and more deaths than any other country, and especially countries far bigger than the United States? Well, I think there's a reason for this, because one, it allowed those who have this plan for the U.S. to participate and lead in this global community, this new world order that is very definitely biblical and prophetic in nature. And therefore, they needed to be able to control, as Joseph Stalin said, he's not concerned about who casts the votes, it's who counts the votes that matter. And therefore, the means by which this pandemic, I believe, was exploited in regards to the election was the creation of massive numbers of mail-in ballots, enough of them to where the 3% that would be changed through the hammer and scorecard software or Dominion software would change the outcome of the state. Now, I think we're seeing clearly that there is something going on. There is something that has been planned. And again, I want to take you back to where we started. The whole world is headed in a direction, and it's unstoppable, and it's irreversible. There is going to be a new world order, as that phrase was coined by the original President Bush, or the first President Bush. And it is something that's been on the mind of many world leaders. And it's all packaged under the guise of equalness, or equality, and fairness, and that all can live a life that is both equal in possessions and opportunity. And really, this is presented again as something that's for the greater good of society. But the reality is, it's Marxism and it's socialism, and those things are against God. Because first of all, we need to recognize, because we've been hearing in the U.S. here about socialism. It's become mainstream. And this was something you used to be able to get arrested for here in the United States, for being a communist. There were those who were tracking people in Hollywood and just everyday citizens in a generation ago here in this country for being a communist. But today there are party members within our Congress who are openly communists and socialists. And, this ought to be troublesome to us, but we have to recognize how this fits into the whole scenario that's leading up to the reign of the Antichrist during the tribulation. The truth is, in socialism and communism, government is God. They are the supplier of all that we need, all that is necessary for sustaining life. They take the wealth of all people and put it into a community pot, which they control, and they distribute the finances. That's where the distribution of wealth mantra comes from. And therefore, they are in control. They take the place of God, just like with Samuel and Saul, we want a king like other people. And God said, well, they're trying to replace me with the human king. Well, so too, this is the same agenda. Socialism and communism is trying to replace God. Because within socialism, that's why when you talk about Russia, that's why when you talk about other socialistic countries, there is no place for God in these systems because the government has to be the source upon which every citizen relies and looks to. There can't be a higher authority than the socialistic and Marxist government. So it's not unusual for us to say, hey, there's a conspiracy that involves socialism going on here in the United States and the advancement of this government control that we see the Democrats have long been pushing for. And now they're trying to manipulate the voting system through these lawsuits to change security protocols. It's basically tipping their hand. And I don't know, I just can't see how we can ignore these facts and the things that are happening right before our eyes. Now, there's something else that's happening that's kind of interesting as we examine what happened there at the end of the elections. We were all glued to our television sets as we were all watching the electoral votes being assigned to one candidate or another. I'm sure most of you were watching, and suddenly at 214, Trump froze, and there was never anything added to him. Even yet today, even though some media outlets have named something that had happened a long time ago, they should have projected President Trump as the winner in North Carolina. Most of the mainstream media websites have still not assigned North Carolina to President Trump, even though he has obviously won that state. They held his number at 214 while Joe Biden continued to climb and climb and climb and climb, even though there was only 1% or less of the vote that had been counted. As soon as the polls would close, they would announce that Biden won. Biden won that state. Now, here's the interesting thing. When things started to shut down and get close, battleground states, 6 of them in number, all stopped counting votes, and for ridiculous reasons. And by the way, that's unconstitutional. They need to count the votes until all votes are counted. And they had a plan and an agenda, which included allowing for the late arrival in the specific states where the race was close or that Trump had a substantial lead in order to bring in these after poll votes that they had been hijacking the right to allow through the court system 360 times in the past two and some odd years. So again, one of the things that I ran into that I thought was curious, having used the pandemic to force many more people through fear into voting through a mail-in ballot, and these 6 battleground states, there was something that I ran across that I thought was kind of interesting. I like and enjoy studying probabilities. There are certain predictions that can be made through basic numeric probabilities. And there's something called Binfold's rule or Binford's rule of mathematical probabilities. And the interesting thing I saw as I walked through this particular study and looking at the research as it relates to this election is basically what it is. It's not really a predictive tool, but it's more of a mathematical law, a law based on probability, and it's the law of repeating numbers. And interestingly, as they ran through this report, and I won't go through all the details of it, it's not super complicated, but it would take time to explain. But there's certain numbers that are more likely to repeat themselves in a chain than other numbers. And they use this for any field of study where numbers are involved. And it's proven itself to be factual, and it does indeed, the pattern holds true. And that's why they call it Binford's rule. It's the rule of numeric probabilities. Now, as I read through this, they used all types of runoffs and races between different candidates from different states, and they used Binford's rule to make this calculation, so to speak, or follow the pattern. And wherever you see it, and basically along the bottom of the page, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And as the number grows, the probability of that number repeating in a following sequence is decreasing. So number 1 will repeat itself more frequently than the other numbers in the 1 through 9 digits that make up our numeric system. 2, it's a little lower. 3 is a little lower, and then off the 7, 8, and 9, it's at the lowest of the scale. But as far as the probabilities and the predictions of probabilities, and I hope you can see my hand here, every Binford rule prediction basically as far as the repetition of numbers, is shaped like this. It's like almost like the Nike swoop. It starts up here or swoosh, and it starts up here and then it flattens out. So they took Benford's rule, applied it to the election. They took those who voted for Trump, and the numbers followed the pattern of Benford's rule. They took local elections of mayors and city councils and all those, and they all followed that rule. And then they used congressional votes, senatorial votes, and all of them, 100% of them, followed Benford's rule as far as the law of mathematical probabilities of repetition. Now, then they took Biden's and they held it up against Benford's rule of mathematical probabilities of repetition, and it was like this. It defied all rules that have held fast as far as the repetitive sequence of numbers. And again, I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this, but the fact is, mathematically, for 6 states to have many of them having a substantial Trump lead, to reverse themselves and all turn for Biden, all 6 of them, is a mathematical impossibility. It just didn't happen. The Pew Research Center also reported that statistically, throughout the history of elections in the United States, 4% of the time, only 4% of the time, will any given voter vote for one president or vote for the president of one party and then vote for a senator of another party. 4% of the time. So if you look at this, which is held true for as long as they've been tracking these types of things in elections, then this too is outside the mathematical probabilities of a reversal of Trump leading in all these states and then winding up losing all these states, and sometimes by a sizable margin. And listen, as we also study just probabilities in and of itself, the probabilities, it's like the odds of a coin toss. The heads-tail ratio is 1 to 2 every time you flip the coin. But the fact is, there are only a limited spread of variation in that 1 to 2 ratio of heads versus tails. If you flip the coin 100 times, it's going to fall somewhere around 40 to 60 in the ratio. It's never going to be 75-25. It's never going to be 80-20. And it's certainly never going to be 100%. So if somebody said, yeah, I flipped a coin, I flipped a quarter 100 times, and it came out heads 100 times, that would indicate that there was an outside source that manipulated the coin toss, because it is absolutely not virtually, it is literally impossible for someone to flip a coin. And they've had computer simulations and the numbers in the billions and billions and billions of coin tosses, and never does it come up heads 100% of the time. So the probabilities of 100% of late ballots being cast for Biden is beyond impossible. Just didn't happen, couldn't happen, never happens. And it's against, again, the law of probabilities. And there's something else we need to remember. When we've been hearing through the mainstream media, which is basically turned into some kind of propaganda machine instead of reporting on facts of what has happened, they try and determine the outcome of what's going to happen through the manipulation of facts and misreporting. And listen, for years and years and years, we've been voting, Terry and I have been voting for a very long time. And I know many of you have been voting for a very long time. And there's one thing that we've heard over and over and over, and Terry and I were just talking about this the other day, and that is that mail-in ballots tend to swing Republican, not Democrat. Well, that's all we've been hearing. Well, Democrats have a greater tendency to vote mail-in ballot. Well, that's not true. It's never been true. We've never ever heard that until this election. Well, they were trying to justify the fact that all of these late post-poll closing ballots that they have now counted, actually, it's pretty typical of the pattern of mail-in and absentee ballots. Well, that's simply not true. I know it personally to be untrue, and it's never been true in the past. So is there a conspiracy going on? Is there an effort to throw this election for the sake of the advancing of globalism? I don't think there's any question that that is true. Now, another thing that we need to recognize is that we're told in the last days that lawlessness is going to abound. Love of many is going to grow cold, and that love speaks of a familial love, a natural affection for one another, and normal things that people would love just by nature. And we're seeing that happen as well. And the lawless thing, I think, is what's important. We have to remember that, until the way this whole process works is that once all the votes are counted, they have to be submitted to each Secretary of State in all 50 states. And that Secretary of State has to certify the vote, and that has to be turned in by December 6th. And within a week or the following Tuesday, I believe, after the certification date of December 6th, then the Electoral College votes. After the legislature of each state selects their Electoral College members. So if we look at all this that's been happening, if we look at how this whole thing has been handled and how the media has been manipulating facts, these ballots haven't been certified. These states have not been certified by the Secretary of State, and the election cannot be called, and there cannot be a president-elect until the Electoral College is voted. And here's another reason why. One thing we need to remember, there have been faithless electors in the past, though there haven't been many, there have been some. And here's what a faithless elector does. The Electoral College is built upon each state's population. That's why California has 55 electoral votes, because California is the biggest state in the country. There's 40 million people living here, and therefore the system allows for California to have that voice, therefore representative of all the state of California, and its therefore population influence in casting a vote and selecting a president. Now, if the Californians had selected Joe Biden as they did for their president, then the Electoral College, all 55 members, need to in the Electoral College cast their vote for Joe Biden. Yet in the past, there have been those what they call faithless electors who voted against the will of the people. Now, this is a frightening thing, because the truth of the matter is they're going against the will of the people, and that's putting the election in the hands of just one or two people who could very, very definitely influence the election. But in looking at what we're seeing, in looking at all the corruption that's clearly happened around this election, it's quite possible that there could be more faithless electors this time who recognize that their state had cheated, and that this vote has been unfair and illegal. And it certainly hasn't been certified by any state in the union, and especially not the states where these votes haven't even been counted in their full as of yet. Now, so lawlessness again could possibly come into play. Another thing we need to recognize is that the Supreme Court ordered the state of Pennsylvania to separate all ballots received after the closing of the polls on Tuesday, November 3rd. Now, they haven't done that. They haven't separated these out. They haven't put the state back in. Well, it's the media actually who hasn't done it. Pennsylvania has not determined who won that state because it hasn't been settled as to which ballots are valid and which are not. We're hearing reports in Michigan of postal workers saying they were told to change the meter on the post date of ballots that were sent or received to accommodate beating the buzzer on election day, so to speak. So we're hearing all kinds of things that are being reported. But here's the interesting thing, and this gets back to the lawlessness thing. Pennsylvania hasn't obeyed the Supreme Court directive. Justice Samuel Alito said you need to segregate all the ballots received after the close of the polls on November 3rd, and they need to be counted separately and identified and sorted through as to if there are any among them that are valid, then they can be added to the other votes. And this, in and of itself, disqualifies from Pennsylvania being called for any state. And yet, Pennsylvania remains in the Biden camp, even though it shouldn't be called at all. And this is going on over and over and over. So here's where I think we need to land in all this, recognizing that there is a plan, there is a conspiracy, there is a move toward globalism. And the United States certainly is going to play a role in that. After all, we are the most powerful country in the world. We are the most influential country in the world. Other countries make their decisions based on the decisions made in the United States because the United States supports other governments and supports and underwrites other governments significantly, sends food all around the world. We are the most generous nation in the history of the world, the most militarily powerful nation in the history of the world, the most technologically advanced nation in the history of the world as well. So yes, we have influence here, and yes, there are going to be those in the United States who have the globalist mentality, who want to see a new world order and see nationalism or national pride as a negative thing. And I think we're hearing more and more of that. And listen, we have seen, and just to go back to when all this really began to take root in our country, and I think it's a shame that our schools or facilities of higher learning were the breeding ground for the contempt for the United States, where socialism was taught by many college professors. And basically, the United States was painted in a negative light to students and college students. And who do we see burning down cities? Who do we see looting? Who do we see setting fire to buildings and all the other things we've been watching through Antifa? We've seen these horrid pictures and videos of beating up people in wheelchairs and older, elderly people who dared to have the audacity to wear a MAGA hat or a Trump T-shirt or have a Trump flag or all these other things. Listen, this is not what the United States is all about. So there's a shift, and it's a shift towards lawlessness. And it's lawlessness at every level. It's lawlessness from the people on the street who are rioting over some of the things that, there's been some legitimate claims concerning abuse and things of that nature and racism. That's present in our country. It's heinous. It's wrong before God. And it doesn't mean that every person who is a Republican or every white male is a racist or any of these other things. But there's a lawlessness that is breeding in all camps and all ethnicities in the world today. Enough so to where violence is now the order of the day, as it was in the days of Noah. And we can't overlook that fact that as we head towards this globalism, Jesus himself said it would be as it was in the days of Noah when it's time for him to return. Now, I've always found it very interesting that Noah and the antediluvian period, which simply means the time of Noah and before, all the way back to Adam, is a span of time somewhere around 2,000 years. And we have basically little information about this particular period. But what we are told about it is that the world was exceedingly violent, and the thoughts and intents of man's heart was only evil continually. And Jesus said that's how it's going to be in the end. The world will be filled with violence, and there will be evil inventions, and the thoughts and intents of man's heart will only be evil. And that's really where we're at. And this is what the devil has been trying to do. And this is the advancement of his agenda that we're seeing unfold. So it should be no surprise that there is an effort to oppress and suppress the church and some of the things. I mean, we've talked about it at church many times, and we just found it fascinating in the limited amount of travels that we've been able to do, that places like Harvard would come out and say, flying on an airplane for multiple hours, as my friend Amir Sarfati travels 12 and 16 hours sometimes, he can sit on a plane just like we did a month or so ago, sit on a plane for hours, 2 inches away from people we don't know, people who aren't part of our own household. And because they're wearing a mask, we're in a low risk situation, as well as the filtration systems on an airplane. And I made the comment when Harvard came out with this study, I can't even tell you how many times I got sick on an airplane because somebody else was sick on an airplane, and the filtration system simply spread that around the plane. So again, this doesn't make any sense. There has to be something underlying that's going on. And I believe that there is an effort to advance the globalist cause, which is going to be headed someday by the Antichrist, who is empowered and inspired by the devil and serves him and points to him and draws worship away from God. So you can come to your own conclusion, but these are facts that are irrefutable. I mean, they are things that have been documented and are going on. There's been an effort to throw this election since 2018. I mean, look at all the money that's been wasted in our country to create some type of association between Trump and the Russians. Look at all the hours and hours and hours that our Congress has spent debating this issue and investigating this issue, tens of millions of dollars to seek to destroy a nationalist president because he doesn't hold to the belief that we need to be moving toward a global community, but he wants to put America first. So it's happening. There's no question about it. We are moving towards the ultimate scenario. And here we have, I believe next year, sometime, I think it's in February or March, what's called the Great Reset. We've got the financial barons of the world who have decided that it's time for a global shift. The International Monetary Fund certainly is involved, and they have said in their meetings without hesitation and without trying to mask anything that we need to take advantage of this pandemic because climate change, which is their mantra, which is their effort to bring about the whole world into submission to one governmental system, is moving too slow. So the pandemic, though short-lived, Prince Charles himself said we need to take advantage of the moment and use this pandemic to advance both efforts to have a global vaccine for this, obviously, but also to move forward more quickly uh, and move and get back into the climate change, which is a real agenda as far as advancing their globalist cause. So I don't know. I just can't see it any other way. And I do believe that we have, for the first time on this scale, I'm sure there's been cheating in other elections. As a matter of fact, I know there's been cheating in other elections because there's humans who cast ballots and want to see their person win at any cost. But we're seeing something now in our country that has never been experienced by our country before. We're seeing large scale efforts, a coup, if you will, to overthrow the Trump administration and bring things back in line with the advancement of the globalist empire, which is something that Satan has ordained and been moving toward, and the Bible has predicted since it was written. So we're headed in that direction, and this is not just another vehicle. So what do we do? Well, we certainly don't roll over and play dead and hope that things come out well. We need to be proactive in this. Certainly wonderful to hear so many Americans got out and voted. 71 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. Joe Biden, who has the nickname of Creepy Joe, but we've seen countless videos about him sniffing the hair of people and doing all these things. How in the world could this man receive more votes than any presidential candidate in the history of U.S. elections is beyond me. Something has to be wrong. Something has to be afoot, so to speak. And I believe it's exactly that. I think the evidence is overwhelming. We need to remember that the media does not call presidential elections. They're trying to influence and manipulate both our emotions and the facts. And, one thing we need to recognize here, they are presenting President elect, so to speak, Biden as the president right now. And that means when the votes are actually counted and this election, which I believe is going to be reversed, and when all the fraud is exposed and all the ballot harvesting and other illegal actions are removed from the total ballot count and President Trump is found to be the winner of this election, I do believe we're going to be seeing what we've all been concerned about in the first place, the rise of Antifa and BLM and others who are going to riot and say Joe Biden had the election stolen from him, when the truth is the opposite is what was actually going on. So you can make your own decision. You can call me a nut, call me fringe, uh, whatever you want to call me. But I'm going to stick with the facts. I'm a facts guy, and that's why I love Jesus, and that's why I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, because it's not a book of fairy tales, it's a book of fact. It talks about the future with the equal certainty that it can describe the present or the past. And therefore, since we have a track record of the Bible proving itself to be true for literally millennia, then we can know that all the specifics and details that we're now watching unfold are going to happen in their fullness as well. Now, in that sense, this is an exciting time to be alive. Even though it's a sad time to be alive, I think as an American citizen, watching our system unravel, the system in which we have placed our trust, to pick lawful leaders that we could rejoice, and rather than wicked ones that we could groan, and to see this unravel before our eyes is a travesty, and it ought to be disheartening to us. But we don't sorrow as people who have no hope, and we are not to be disheartened, because the fact of the matter is God is still on the throne, and he is still sovereign over the affairs of men, and Jesus is still the head of the church. We still have much to be thankful for. We can be thankful for what we have experienced in these past 4 years. If for some reason Joe Biden does get handed the election, I personally will continue to think that something is afoot and that he didn't actually win. And, others can think I'm wrong, and you might think that too, but I'm going to stick with the facts. But I'm not going to lose my hope. I'm not going to lose my joy. I'm going to continue to serve the Lord and give God glory for all that he has done, because someday all this mess is going to be over. There's are going to be no elections in heaven. There are no candidates running against God except Satan, and he's going to be cast down into the lake of fire, where he's going to be with the beast and the false prophet forever and ever and ever. So, great time to have expectation of the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, because he promised he was going to come again and receive us unto himself. And he said, you know what? When I'm going to come back, here's what it's going to be like. Lawlessness is going to be abounding. The natural love and affection that a family would have for one another is going to start to wane. It's going to grow cold in many people. It's going to be a very violent time. And people are going to be filled with only evil thoughts, and the intentions of their heart will be only evil continually. He said through other prophets, he said as he prophesied through Paul, as the Holy Spirit spoke to him, telling us what the last days are going to be like. He said they're going to be perilous. People will be lovers of themselves and haters of God, boasters, headstrong, haughty, proud, disobedient to parents, all the things that we see going on in our world today. So it only stands to reason that as this particular generation advances, it's going to see all things fulfilled that Jesus spoke of concerning the days prior to and after his coming for the church. It only stands to reason that it's going to be a difficult time, and we're going to see lawlessness advancing, and even in good old US of A, which breaks my heart to say, we're going to see these things gain a foothold and continue to advance. Now, my prayer is that we have another 4-year respite under President Trump, where he continues to stand with Israel. Joe Biden has already said that he's going to rejoin within the first months of his presidency the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with the Iranians. And he's also stated that he is going to sign into law the Equality Act. And if you don't know what that is, that inserts LGBT and gender identity into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protected people of color from being discriminated against. He is going to make equal sexual orientation with being a person of color. And as it relates to the Civil Rights Act, being black in particular, and where our country, segregation obviously was wrong, was an evil that much of our country practiced. And growing up here in California has been a bit different, because California is kind of a melting pot. It's a foreign concept to me for somebody to have hatred for somebody because of the color of their skin. But we know there are portions of our country where this was true. And it did happen, and it needed to be righted, and it has been righted. So now you've got people who have a sexual preference that is outside the parameters as defined in God's will, who have now been equated to people of particular ethnic groups, and therefore they will, under Joe Biden, have every right that the black community was so rightfully rewarded under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, here's one of the things I think that we need to be aware of, and here's why we need to be continuing to pray that these things get exposed, this evil gets exposed, any cheating gets exposed, is because part of the Civil Rights Act is that, remember, there were white bathrooms and there were, as they called them, colored bathrooms. Now, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written into law, here's what it did. It made sure that a black person could go into a public restroom and not be made to feel uncomfortable. That's part of the law. You cannot have someone come into the bathroom because they're a different skin color of yours, public bathroom in a restaurant, in a hotel, in a mall, or a public park, at the beach, anywhere else. You cannot have a person of a different skin color come into the room and be made uncomfortable by you. You have to make them feel like they have every right to be there just like you. Now, here's the thing. What that means is this. Under Biden's administration, within the first 100 days, he's going to incorporate into the Civil Rights Act people of a sexual preference that includes the LGBT, transgender, and queer community. Now, what that means, what that translates into is this. Ladies, listen close. Men, listen close. If a man decides that he is a woman and dressed in full male clothing, he doesn't have to dress like a woman, doesn't have to be a drag queen type or anything like that. If a man decides that he is a female, that he can go into the women's restroom, and the women inside need to make them feel comfortable and welcome, just like they would a person of a different skin color. A husband standing outside who watches a man walk into the women's restroom because he feels like he's a woman has to make that man feel comfortable that he's going into the women's restroom. This is a 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, add to this, here's why Joe Biden's presidency cannot come to pass. Here's why we need to do everything we can to stop it, including supporting the lawsuits that have been filed by President Trump and Rudy Giuliani and others. That also means that a young teenager, male, biological male, genetic male, chromosomal male, an XY male, goes into or feels like he or identifies as a female, he has every right to go into your daughter's high school, junior high, primary school, locker room, and shower area. And get this, under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which he will be identified with, he has to be made to feel as though he has every right to be there, and he has to be made comfortable by those who are present and not be made to feel like he's out of place. Listen, this is where Biden is trying to take this country. So is there a conspiracy? You bet there is. There's a conspiracy against all things that are right before God. And therefore, we need to stand against this and pray against this and fight against this and make our voice heard. And, sadly, there were those there at the end of the election cycle who came out and spoke publicly as Christians and pastors in particular against President Trump. Because of his past character flaws and present behavior, they just couldn't see themselves voting for Trump. And therefore, they weren't going to vote at all, or they were going to cast their vote for Biden. So I'm not sure what planet these people are from or what book they're studying. But listen, for me, Trump he's got a potty mouth sometimes. Other presidents have had that too. He's blustery and boisterous, and he's egotistical, and he's all those things. But I'll tell you one thing that I'm going to support, and why I have supported him and do support him. He's not for men going in the women's bathroom. He's not for babies being executed in the womb like Joe Biden is. He has no intention of rejoining the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. He's the one that got us out of that mess, which all it was doing was fleecing Americans for our money. And that's our money. Listen, there's no such thing as government funded. The government doesn't have any money. That's our money. That's our money they're spending. And we need to stand up and make them accountable for how they spend our money. They shouldn't be using our money, our tax dollars, both to fund our enemy or to fund abortion, which is an abomination before God. So listen, there is much at stake, and you bet there's a conspiracy, but it's not just about this election. It's been going on since the garden, when Satan conspired against God, and he questioned the word of God to Eve and said, hath God said? And Eve fell for the trap. Adam just blatantly sinned and took the fruit that Eve handed him, and he ate in direct disobedience to God. And here we are dealing with the aftermath of all that. And yes, the world is headed in a specific direction, and it involves a new world order, if you want to use that label. And it's being advanced by globalists, if you want to use that label. And this election has everything to do with the advancement of that global cause, which is the plan of the devil. So, yeah, it matters. What happened on November 3rd here in the United States matters. And you may not like President Trump, but listen, he stands for a lot more that's like us than is not. And it's too late to cast our votes now, but you can sure be praying. And listen, I hear this a lot, and I've said this multiple times over this past election season, and I'll close with this here tonight. God is not going to change the balance. When the Bible talks about him raising up kings and setting them down, that's talking about his ability, his authority, and his capabilities. And he can certainly do that. But we live in a democratic republic, so to speak, and that means we vote for our rulers. And the choice of rulers is spread equally amongst all 50 states. through the Electoral College, and we're going to get who we voted for. But what God is against is cheating. What he is against is an unjust measure. And therefore, he said an unjust measure or an unbalanced scale, meaning someone who would cheat and have dishonest weights to weigh a product that would be sold in the marketplace. That God says that type of behavior is an abomination to him. So let's make sure there's no abomination in this election and therefore pray according to the will of God. Because I do not believe for 1 second that the evidence says, the facts say, Joe Biden won this election. I think there's been a conspiracy that's long been at work, and especially as it relates to this election in earnest in 2018. Why else would you need to change the security protocols for absentee and mail-in ballots if you didn't have a plan to manipulate them? This is what's going on in our world today. But Jesus is coming soon. And the most important thing is that we not tell people about Trump, but we tell people about Jesus. This is where we need to spend our focus and time, even as we stand up for the truth in this country and continue to be salt and light. And listen, we don't have to roll over and put up with these things. And Paul, remember, Paul was being threatened with imprisonment, being beaten, and even being executed. And he said, hey, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen, and I appeal to Caesar. And that meant his case had to be heard by the highest official in the land, Caesar himself. Paul took advantage of his Roman citizenship. We need to take advantage of our American citizenship as Christians in America and seek to protect ourselves in that sense through the system, just like Paul did. And we need to stand for what's right and true, just like Paul did. And he wasn't willing to die for nothing. He would die for Christ at any moment, but he was not going to die just for the sake of being killed without any benefit to his martyrdom, so to speak. So nothing wrong with us standing up. And yes, absolutely, Christians, I hear this constantly, and it just baffles me. Listen, if Christians didn't stand up and get involved in the political theater, we wouldn't have a country. The Black Robe Regiment, a group of pastors, stood up in the Revolutionary War and stood against taxation without representation and tyranny. And indeed, that's why we have the United States of America today, because pastors, as it was described by many in Great Britain, pastors were preaching fiery sermons that ignited the people to stand against what was happening, the wrongs that were being done to them. So not calling for violence or any of those things. We're not to be a violent people. But we do have the right to defend ourselves in war and all these other things. And so there's nothing wrong with being in the military when you're a Christian or any of those things. But listen, we're in the last of the last days, and it's going to be perilous, and it's going to be a defection from truth within the church. And listen, if the church loses its way, there's no more preserving and purifying influence that the world has. Jesus said, you exclusively are the light of the world. You exclusively are the salt of the earth. So we are the purveyors and promoters of the light of the gospel, and we are the purifying influence holding back utter lawlessness. And it's only when we are removed that lawlessness is going to have its day here on this earth. But it will be short-lived, because God is going to deal with this planet in the 7-year tribulation period. So again, sad times for sure, but there's still hope. Listen, this election isn't over, and we need to stand up, and we need to be praying, and we need to have our voices heard, and we need to have the election count be fair. That's our goal, is that truth will prevail, and God is always on the side of truth, and he's always against the cheat, and he will, we're told in Nahum, he will in no way acquit the wicked. So therefore, wickedness, we don't want wickedness to prevail. And listen, we'll live with an honest vote, an honest count. And if Trump lost, then we're just going to have to deal with it and move forward as good citizens. But we need to make sure that this was actually honest. The evidence says it was nothing but crooked from the get-go, and this started 2 years ago. So with that said, again, thank you for tuning in and putting up with what we're talking about tonight. I know we, especially here in the States, I know people watch via Facebook all over the world, but especially we here in the States, this is a burden on our hearts. And I thought it worthy to address what the facts are so we can see the fact is there is a conspiracy, but Jesus is coming soon. Keep your eyes on the prize and lift it up above the moment. and focus on him and tell everybody you know that there is a God who loves them, who sent his son into the world, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. So I'm Barry Stagner, wishing you a blessed week and evening, and keep praying. And you outside the country who love America, pray for our country as well. And what we're praying for is truth and a fair election. God bless you.